Before we start, two things. One thing is the dog is very frustrated up in the room knowing everyone's down here. So I thought I'd just bring him down here. But the other thing is, when we talked about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, to understand, I'm going to give you one text from Paul, but to understand that's a theological construction about the gifts. Actually, everything that happens to you is in fact a gift from the Spirit. Circumstances and everything. Colossians 1:24. Paul says, I consider the translation in most Bibles, I consider myself privileged to make up within myself the sufferings yet to be undergone by Christ Jesus for his church. Okay? But if you read the original, he says, I consider myself gifted. So he's saying right there that suffering is a gift too. And I think one of the things you discover in the area of theology, and by in theology I mean your experience of life, is that what happens to a person is not the issue. The issue is what a person does with what happens to them. So you can have a disaster in this life that turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to them, and the same disaster will destroy someone else. And you can have a blessing in someone's life that will destroy them. And you have a blessing in someone's life, and it's wonderful. We had a young lady in San Luis who won the lottery. I found her because one Sunday in the collection there was a check for $10,000. And she'd won the lottery the day before, so what the heck. But she was a waitress in San Luis Obispo, and she began, college student, most of them are waitresses. Big money if you're cute waitress. Anyway, the young lady bought cars and houses for friends and relatives and everything. And in 11 years, the money was gone. And she was studying to be a dentist, doing her chemistry degree at Poly. And without going more into the story, she's an older waitress in San Luis today. And why? Because the blessing she had subtracted the one great thing she was about, which was dentistry. And now she's older and this sort of thing. You can't get in dental school at her age and that sort of stuff. She have to redo her chemistry. It's changed. And so the human life has absolutely nothing to do with what happens to you, and everything to do with what you do with it, you know? And we have books and books and books about people like Helen Keller and stuff like that, and what they do with what occurs to them. And so to understand that anything that happens to in your life is actually a gift from God, you have to figure out how to unwrap it. But whatever happens to you is a gift from God. There are no negatives. And I've certainly, you know, in my life, the things that have happened to me, and I had polio when I was in the hospital, 3.5 years old, and just, you know, and I remember that was before Salk or anything like that. And I recovered. There were 4 people. It tended to be in pockets. There were 4 people who got it in our area. 2 of them died in a couple months. One of them was in an iron lung for 17 years, and me. You know, it's just, you just look at these things that go on. It has to do with what you do with them, not with the other thing. Okay? Now, so what we were going to cover today is the list of what are called the fruits of the Spirit. And I want you to know again, this list comes largely from St. Paul, but in theology we know that there's no limit to this list. There are all kinds of things. But if you go through this list, it'll give you sort of a tenor of the way to look at things. But there are specific signs if the Spirit is working in you. And these are the ones that Paul chooses. But having read them, you'll know that you know, the fact I drink too much is not a sign that the Spirit's working in me. Well, maybe some spirits. But anyway, the idea is, you know, but you'll get a tenor from the listing that will indicate, you know, kind of what's meant. So the fruits of the thing. The first one has to do with charity. And what, in the Pauline idea of charity, it's administering to someone in need, okay? And now what would be ministering to someone in need? Ministering to someone in need can be giving advice, can be being personal support to them. It can be 1,000 different things. But this idea of recognizing need and moving towards it, I think one of the things about this is you need to figure out the most comfortable way for you to do these things. I personally believe that when God created you, He created you with a natural leaning to certain things. And those natural leanings are the way God actually leads you. You know, you think of, well, like for me, in becoming a priest. Why did I become a priest? Well, I would say it's a combination of, I think, you know, all children, when they decide what they want to be in their earliest years, will always pick someone who wears a uniform. Whether it's a policeman, a doctor, a fireman, a priest. You know, you pick someone who wears a uniform. And because of that, you can be a doctor as soon as you put on the white coat. You don't have to go through school or anything. The uniforms make people. So kids tend to do that. So like I did that. I went into that. Because of my year in the hospital with polio, I was very introverted. The idea of being, you know, away from people in that way was really appealing to me. But I look at all kinds of things. It was a natural. It was actually a natural. It was very difficult to go through the studies and all that stuff, but the life was a natural. And I believe that that's the way virtue, God constructed you towards certain virtues. Now, this idea of charity, there are some people who really like to do charity, but are uncomfortable in kind of the way it's done. So, like for instance, it's very charitable to go to a soup kitchen and serve the homeless, okay? But it's no less charitable to provide the money for the food that goes to the homeless. And so some people are more comfortable contributing the money. Some people are more comfortable with actually doing it, but you need to find out where it builds you, okay? Now, if it builds you more to be face-to-face with the person in need and stuff, then you should always do your charity that way, okay? If it builds you up more to know that you have done that thing one way or another, then that's the way to do it. But charity is this awareness that no matter who we are, there are people who are less blessed than we are. And no matter who we are, there's something we can do to give, you know, to help them. There is something we have to offer that's unique to people. And sometimes it's advice, this sort of thing. I may have told you this story or not. When I was a young boy on the way home from school, my parents, I like to describe my parents as being Catholics with a vengeance. But my parents were very Catholic. So when they decided to build a home, they built the very first home in Pacific Beach in San Diego. And the home that was built was across the street from the land the church had purchased to build a school. And so, and they went there because I was on the age to enter first grade. They didn't have kindergartens when I went through school. I was at the age to enter first grade when the school was to open. Well, the school opened 1 year later. So my parents, for first grade, I had a 2-hour bus ride in which I'd go downtown, change buses, and go over to St. Charles Borromeo, which is in a whole other section of town, and went to classes. And at that time, as a child, you were always safe on the bus. It wasn't a thing. So I did that. But I was coming home on the bus one day, and I always sat in the back of the bus, and I didn't have the uniform for the Catholic school because I was going to be at a different school the next year, and I had to have a uniform there. So I was exempted from the uniform. And I got up, I always sat in the back. I got up, I walked forward. I didn't talk to anyone on the bus because none of the kids there came from Pacific Beach. They all came from the Coronado area where that school was. So anyway, I'm coming down the aisle, and just as I get off the bus, the woman sitting right at the end, an elderly woman I've never seen before or since, this elderly woman looked at me as I'm going, and she says, "You're going to be a priest." What the hell? So, I mean, I just thought it was cute, you know, that was the end of it. But when I was thrown out of the seminary, the very day the man threw me out of the seminary, in fact, at the very time, that went off in my mind like neon. And I heard that in my mind every day until I got into the seminary again. And I now have come to believe that that was an angel. And it was planting the seed that I needed during that period. It wasn't, you're going to work to be a priest. It wasn't this. It says, you will be a priest. And I never talked to her. I never talked to anyone. I didn't have a uniform on. I don't know how she knew I was Catholic. I didn't act like a Catholic, you know. But anyway, to understand that I have no idea what was going on in her mind or anything, but she administered something very powerful to me that worked powerfully in my life. And that, you know, you think all she did was sit there and say something, but it was the right thing for the right time. And the very simple things we can do, and that's all called charity. That all comes under charity, this ability. And also in charity, understand you oftentimes exercise charity towards your spouse. You oftentimes exercise charity towards your children. That this can all be works of charity. And so that's one of the signs of the presence of the Spirit. The second one is the most important one to me personally. But the second one is joy. You know, one of the things I loved about COVID was that the dispensation from going to Mass on Sunday. That any of you who are Eucharistic ministers know that as you distribute communion, you have certain people who come up with a look on their face and you can just read it in your mind. I got to Mass on Sunday, so he can't send me to hell, you know, the body of Christ. and then they go sit down, okay? But the fact of the matter is, after the COVID thing, the people at church were just the people who wanted to be there. And I think these people who don't want to be there actually are a weight on a congregation. They actually weigh the congregation down. And people who are really given to the Spirit are people who find joy everywhere and constantly. They live in an environment of joy. And I want you to know joy and happiness are very different. A person who lives in an environment of joy, they can go through very sad times, but that doesn't violate the joy. It'll violate the happiness, but not the joy. But they hold this stance of joy. And I would take the stance of joy to those of you who actually have jobs you really enjoy. You know, oftentimes you go to work, it's very difficult. Maybe you have to fire someone that day. Maybe you have to do something. But you have joy there because that's essentially what you want to do. You carry joy. And if this relationship with God is something I essentially want to do, well, that goes on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so I will carry that joy. So to look for joy in yourself as really one of the signs of the Spirit. The next one has to do with peace. And one of the difficulties of peace is that we tend to think of it in terms of absence. We don't think of peace in a positive way. And it's because we live in such a violent world. Like, for instance, when we think of peace in the Ukraine, what we think of as the Russians go home and the Ukrainians stop the fighting, and that will be peace. No, that's the end of a war. Peace is a very positive and creative thing. And so what builds peace? That has very much to do with individuals. It's not just the end of conflict. Peace is a thing in itself. And if you were to study the, founders of our country, you would discover that what they were aimed at was that people should lead peaceful lives. That's what they were about. And that wasn't just the war with England, that they wanted people to lead peaceful lives. I want you to know that the understanding of peace, and probably many of these, grows as time goes on. And you can watch, I don't know if any of you have ever visited Williamsburg in Pennsylvania. You ever get a chance to visit it, it's a great place. But one of the things they do there, it's partly reconstruction, but it's partly a city that was left there, Williamsburg. And it dates from before the Revolution. And it was a very prominent city in the colonies right after we got our independence from England. And they enact different things there, but one of the things is a court. You go into the enactment of the court, and they say, we're going to put together a jury now. And they invite all the visitors, stand up, they stand up, and they say, we're going to pick out a jury now, and because all men are created equal, we're able to, call a jury, unlike England at the time. So we're able to call a jury. So he says, because all men are created equal, I'm going to ask all women to sit down. Then he says, I'm going to ask anyone under the age of, I forget what it was, to sit down. He says, ask anyone who doesn't own land to sit down. I asked all blacks and Asians to sit down. And he goes through this list. When he gets through, the only ones standing are landowning Episcopalians. If you're landowning and Episcopalian, you count. And trust me, they didn't get 12 people, okay? But the idea is, historically, we have come to where we understand that we were deformed by the all men. It isn't just men. It's children, it's women. It isn't confined to a nationality. It isn't confined to a religion, that all people are created equal. And if you're alert to this, what's going on in our country right now, that's going much further. Right now, animals have rights. Right now, trees have rights. We're fish, frogs, they have rights, to exist. And what we're watching the growth to a single phrase, all men are created equal. And we're beginning to understand that, I think, the way God intended it. I think God really spoke through those leaders. I don't know if you're familiar with studying different religions, but if you study the Mormons regard all those documents as inspired, just like the Bible. And you read those documents, and it's easy to think that. They were very, very strong on all kinds of things like that. And remember, they weren't deeply religious men. Like if you were to study someone like Jefferson or someone like that, you discover that they didn't have a lot to do with religion. Now, understand at that time, if you didn't go to church, you were had. Everyone had to go to church. Even if you burned witches on the weekend, you had to go to church. So they all went to church, but you read in their writings, they weren't strong on that. But they understood the nature of a human being. And peace is one of those things. The next one is probably, in my mind, the most difficult. It's patience. And one of the curious things, I would be willing to bet, I wish Father Perry were here, but I would be willing to bet, and I'll speak it personally, the sin I most frequently hear is impatience. And I hear it from parents mainly, okay? These little demons drive their parents over the wall. So, but this thing of patience. But do you know, patience has to do with this knowledge that, like, it's really funny that when you're dealing with your child, and depending on how you do it and go through it, you have the element of patience in it. Like when my son was much younger and sort of things, when he was in the later years of high school, when different things would go on and I'd have to correct him about certain things, he always had a standard answer for me. He says, one day I'll be taking care of you. Okay, he would remind, and that's true, you know, you look at your kids, one day they're going to be taking care of you. But you know, when you're raising these little kids and dealing with them, you know that ultimately they're going to run the world. That's the generation that will be running the world eventually. That's gone on. And I'm sure all our parents looked at us in terror that one day he'll be running the world, you know? But that's where our patience should come from. I know ultimately where this is going. So I need to act with patience because, you know, I think one of the wonderful things about being an adult, you can look at your own life and realize how messed up the whole thing was for you. And it worked out, you know? We do the most bizarre things and crazy things, and you know, it's just, it worked out. And so to be able to deal with patience, and we were told this with regards to the seminary, with regards to preaching and things like this. You have to remember, God has called you to preach, but it's God's job to make sure everyone's saved. I don't need to save people, okay? That's his job. My job is to preach, and I trust that he's exceptionally good at saving people. And I know that because what he did in my life. So I can deal with him with the knowledge that, you know, in this sort of thing, that there are people who reject what you say, there are people who are really upset by what you say, that once everything's said and done, he's going to win them. Whether he wins them through me or not, that isn't the issue. My job's to preach, his job's to save. But to remember that and learn to act with patience in the knowledge of how things ultimately go. The next one is kindness. And I think you know that kindness is much more than what you do. Kindness has to do with the way you do it. Kindness is a method of living. And you watch this perfectly in the life of Jesus. I'll give you an example. You remember the story of the woman taken in adultery? And they're all getting ready to stone her and everything. Do you know that Jesus never talks about the sin when he starts? What's the first thing he does? The text says, let the one without sin throw the first stone. That isn't what Jesus said. That's according to Luke, because I don't think Luke understood what Jesus would have said. But what Jesus really said is, let the one who witnessed the crime throw the first stone. Because under Jewish law, if someone's accused of something and they have to be killed by stoning, the first stone has to be thrown by the one who knows the crime happened. And that way, we're all participating in his thing. But if the one who throws the first stone is not an eyewitness to the crime, then that person becomes a murderer. And so you have to have an absolute eyewitness to the crime in order to invoke particularly the death penalty for Judaism. So Jesus said, let the one without sin, let the one who saw the sin throw the first stone. And we know largely from the tenor of the text that the woman was probably a prostitute. Everyone knew what she did, so that's what they were stoning her for. But no one had seen a particular event. You know, most prostitution goes on in pretty private circumstances. So if you've seen the crime, you're probably a participant, you know. So it's best not to go into that. But so Jesus says this, and then the woman's there, and Jesus asks her where everyone's gone. And why does he do that? She is not concerned about the fact she's a sinner. She's concerned about the fact she's going to die. So once everything's over, Jesus will say, go and do not do this again, basically. He says, go and do not do this again. But he never talks about sin in the beginning. Why? Because that would be unkind. Is the sin there? Yes. Does he know it? Yes. Everyone knows it. But the fact of the matter is, the kindness of Jesus looks at her. What's she most interested in? She thinks she's a dead woman. So he says, you're not. You're going to walk out of here alive. Now, let's deal with the sin. Okay? But you see Jesus in the most horrendous circumstances always acts with great kindness. And again, another place, if you want to see the kindness of Jesus, look how he led you to him. Just look at your own life. That how gently he did, one of the things that really amazed me, I don't know if you've had an experience of this, but I've worked a lot in Soledad prison as a chaplain, and I worked there 17 years. And I was pastor of the parish, but I would go in. And it was amazing to me how often I would listen to one of these guys recount their path of crime, their path to the jail cell, and how often it began with something I did. But the neighborhood that I was in, when I stole candy from the store, they called my mother. They didn't call the police. That wasn't done. I'd actually been safer in the hands of the police. They have standards about what they can do. Mothers don't, But anyway, how often I would see these people, I would think to myself, God must have been working overtime when I was a kid, that I'm on this side of the bars when this is going on. But to look in your own life at how God led you to where you are and realize his immense kindness. At no time did he absolutely slap you down as we deserved. At no time did he intervene that way. But he has a way of drawing us along in his kindness. The next thing is goodness. And I see that very much as part of the kindness thing. I really wouldn't go on much to that. And the other word is generosity. Generosity is the ability to give more than is required of you. And so, like as a parent, each of your children is entitled to some of you. Your spouse is entitled to some of you. You know that there's all entitlements around you. And with regards to all of these, generosity is the time you give more. That's generosity. And I would cite this in my own family when I was being raised. I was talking to the people at table because of my dyslexia and my parents' great education, that when I was being raised, when we studied the Civil War in grade school, I think it was 6th grade, but when we studied the Civil War, our summer vacation, the preceding vacation, took place in Gettysburg. When we were about to start science in school, our summer vacation, the preceding summer, was in Chicago at the Museum of Industry and Science. And I could go through this with every year of school. My parents found out what the major thing we would cover the next year in school, because I get a huge amount out of experiences, not out of reading. So my parents sort of, worked this whole thing. But I think about it, we never once went to some place that was important to my sister. I had to live with that little genius, that there's something about God that he endows younger sisters with brains. I don't know why he does that. It's just an insult to older brothers. But I think he does it. My sister had a photographic memory. And I've told you this before, but just as an example of her education, my sister wanted to raise horses. She loved horses. And so she decided that's what she wanted to do. My parents were really into education. So they said, you get your degree, and then we'll support you in whatever you want to do. So my sister, with her background at neuro trouble, she got a full and complete scholarship to UC Berkeley. She went there, she got a doctorate in physics with a minor in math. Then she came home. My parents helped her buy a ranch, and she raised and trained quarter horses her entire life, okay? But, so, I mean, she was bright. She did not need the help I did. So my parents were generous with that with regards to me. And this idea of giving more than is required of us in some areas. And the next one is gentleness. Gentleness is one of the great prophecies of the Messiah. And you remember, Jesus will quote it. It appears in the Old Testament where it says, the smoldering flax he will not quench, and the bent reed he will not break. Well, the smoldering flax refers to starting a fire. That the flax is the fiber in some plants. So you start the fiber, and then you put on little pieces of wood and leaves, and then it get it going, you put small sticks, then you throw a log on. But this idea of not quenching the flax is the idea of starting the flax and throwing a log on it, that you quench it. You know, you have to nurse it along. And the same thing with the flax. Flax is what they're really referring to, the bent reed, they're really referring to papyrus, the stuff out of which they used to make paper. It grows in near the shore of actually the Nile River, but in many rivers. But if a wind comes, it blows it all over. And if you try and stand one up, you break it. But you can move them up gently and raise them. And so that is Shaddai. So that's the that's what's meant by the thing, this whole action of gentleness. And when Jesus came on the scene, you know, part of the gentleness of Jesus, you notice how often, like for instance, the story of the rich young man, when he says, "What am I supposed to do?" And Jesus says, "Sell what you have, come follow me." And the man leaves Jesus. And the scriptures record that Jesus, you know, really loved him. Do you know in the Eastern churches, he's a canonized saint? And that's because they have in their history the fact that he came to the Christian community much after all the apostles were dead. That he was drawn to the Christian community and entered in. And the idea that if Jesus talks to him and he walks away, Jesus knows it's the Father's job to save them. His job was to open the door. If he didn't go through now, God will open another door. God never accepts a no, you know, to salvation. If you say yes, he's got you. If you say no, all God hears is come back later. And that's what he does, till he gets the yes. So this gentleness. And the next one is faithfulness. And remember that faithfulness, a lot of times authors refer this as referring to faith, but faithfulness means you stick to what you're doing, okay? That you realize, and that really has a lot to do with patience, that you don't just, you know, abandon it, but realize it. And one of the things, I hope a lot of you read Lives of Saints, but one of the wonders of Lives of Saints is that their most important accomplishments a lot of times took place after they died. That, you know, they never got to see the real flowering of what their work, but they trusted in God, stuck to it, and it goes on this way. The next one is modesty. Modesty is badly interpreted in our society. It has nothing to do with the way you dress and stuff like that. But modesty is not drawing attention to yourself, okay? To not consciously draw attention to yourself. Now, there are things you do and stuff that automatically draws attention to you, but that isn't what you're about, okay? The most immodest thing is to dress in such a way, you know, that attracts attention to you. That's why we assign it to certain kinds of swimsuits, let's say, as being immodest, because God knows they draw attention, okay? But the whole thing is drawing attention to yourself. The next one, God, I hate this one. The next one is self-control. And it's the ability, how should I put it? The ability to be your own disciplinarian. You know, that's one of the problems with dieting. Like, dieting depends on self-control. You know, there isn't anyone right beside you always smacking you and saying something. That depends, actually, on self-control. There are a lot of things in human life. Another example of the thing is exercise. Exercise depends on self-control. You know, there's no outside control to it. And so that we need in our lives to be able to establish this sort of thing. In the history of the church, what we normally attach to acquiring this is like doing penance, like not eating meat on Friday and stuff like that. That if I can, you know, go through a week and say, on this day, I will eat no meat, why, I'm in control. I'm in control of my life that way. And so this self-control, we can apply to different things, and we can learn it basically through this self-discipline that, you know, whatever we do as far as the thing goes on. And the last one has to do with chastity. Chastity is a very complex virtue. And the reason why chastity is complex is chastity actually relates to everyone, but it relates to married people very different than it relates to a single person. You know, the way you had to live a chaste life before you were married is not the way you live a chaste life after you're married. But chastity has to do with this ordered sexuality in the area in which you're to, you know, function. And like, for instance, a spouse who would refuse to be involved sexually with a spouse has violated chastity, because this is part of the expression of love within a marriage system, okay? So that's as much a violation of chastity as would adultery be in a priest, okay? It's just as much a violation. Chastity is having your sexuality ordered to the life you're in. And I'd like you to know that sexuality is the strongest drive in human beings, and it is the most difficult to keep under watch. You have to keep under watch all the time. And we happen to live in a society where it is practically impossible to keep it under watch. Like, for instance, one of the things, I told you I worked for the Canadian government at one time trying to construct laws against pornography. And in doing this, we were working in a system that is very different than we work today. What causes pornography to flourish is, number one, if no one can know about it. Like when I was in high school, if you bought what we called a dirty magazine, you didn't do it in your own neighborhood, okay? You never wanted to be seen with that magazine, okay? So it has to do with that kind of privacy and availability. And by definition, that's the internet. At home, where no one's around, you can't have access to all of it. You know, when I was a pastor, right from when we got the internet, the computer in which I do my work on, I've never connected to the internet. And one of the reasons is I don't want other people to have access to some stuff before I publish it, okay? So none of that stuff is available to others. So the internet I always have on the iPad. And so the iPad's on the internet. But I kept my iPad in a locked office to which the secretary had a key. And when she'd come in to work in the morning, then I could go in and I could work on my iPad and do everything I wanted and all that sort of thing. And when she went home at night and locked the office, the iPad was closed. And it's because it's so enticing and so easy that I had to draw the line there. I was never around the internet when I was alone. And I don't need to explain to you. You're not going to sit in an office with a secretary at a church and look at pornography. No, it isn't done. So anyway, those are the fruits of the Spirit. I want you to know that, as I said earlier, this is an artificial list. They've taken a list from Paul and added a couple of other things. This list actually comes from Thomas Aquinas. But he's added just about, I think, modesty, self-control, and chastity came from Thomas Aquinas, okay? But the thing is, what you want to do is, are there results from your life that are good? The good results in your life come from the Holy Spirit. And be aware of this with regards to other people. Like you look at someone like Gandhi, the Spirit is operative there. You look at someone like Martin Luther King, Spirit is operative there. Look at, when you see someone about good, whether they believe in God or not, the Spirit is operative in them. I always remember one of the things, Fulton Sheen was doing an interview one time with a man who he was responsible for building a hospital. And he wasn't a rich man. He was able to get people together, and this huge hospital was built. And Bishop Sheen was interviewing him. And at one point in the interview, the man said to Bishop Sheen, he says, I really don't believe in God. And Fulton Sheen says, that doesn't matter. He obviously believes in you. And the fact of the matter is, the Spirit must have been working through the man, through what he produced, And so be aware of people and the Spirit operative in them, and move with gentleness in drawing people into the relationship with Jesus or whatever, Understand that's God's job to do it. You open the door, you go around, and be very careful about wasting your time. I find oftentimes Christians will waste their time, their evangelical time, on someone where it isn't going to work. If you have adult children who are away from the church, someone else is going to convert them, not you, okay? Adult children who are away from the church, don't waste your time. You're spinning your wheels there usually, okay? And there are people you're called to convert. But trust me, God has someone designated whose job it is to get that kid into the church. And God, I think if what history proves anything, he knows what he's doing. Okay? So, we'll see if there are any questions. Go ahead.
Can I ask a question off topic? There's no questions on topic?
Of course not. Go ahead.
With the recent passing of Pope Benedict.
Passage of what?
The passing of Pope Benedict.
Yes.
Could you comment on an observation or anything on Pope Benedict? Any thoughts?
But I think the only thing that I would say is that, first of all, Pope Benedict himself is the most brilliant theologian the Catholic Church has ever seen, and the most brilliant pope. There's no question of that. No one argues that at all. The defect of Benedict was he was not a pastor, and he was a teacher, but not a pastor. And in the teaching, he was excellent. And when he became pope, he came to realize that. And he came to realize that in a lot of things. He was a member of the Hitler Youth. Now, if you weren't a member of Hitler Youth when Hitler was around, your parents' lives were in danger. So he's a member of the Hitler Youth. But, and some people held that against him, which was baloney. He came into the sexual problem in the church. He had nothing to do with that or anything. Some people held that against him. So he realized he was carrying some unnecessary baggage. And I think he realized he was not a pastor. But he did something that most people don't realize. During his election, the number 2 man behind him was Francis in the election. So when he was elected, he became pope, but the next number 2 man was Francis. Now, normally, when a pope dies, They wait for the cardinals to come to Rome, and they have the celebration of the funeral of the Pope, and then they have the conclave. Well, while they're waiting for the funeral and getting on, that's when they all discuss among themselves who they might want to see the next Pope. That becomes a very big thing, and that's where the next Pope is really decided. By retiring, that couldn't happen. Not only that, if he had retired 6 months later than he did, Francis wouldn't have been at the conclave. Because of his age, he wouldn't be allowed at the conclave. So Benedict retired in such a way that they never got together to discuss anyone else, knowing that the next vote was Francis, and get out just at the last moment that Francis could be elected. Benedict is the first man in history as a pope to put his successor in office. And he put Francis in. And why? Because Francis is a pastor. He's a consummate pastor. He's not a theologian, then not a liturgist. He is a consummate pastor. And so Benedict made sure he got in. And I think, it's an amazing thing to have the qualities he did as a theologian. It's a remarkable thing to realize that someone can do a certain job, have great honor. Someone can do a better job than you. And it must have been very difficult for him during that period to watch Francis running the church so differently than him when he could have been doing it, And yet, the anti-Francis movement that incidentally is strongest in the United States. The United States is the strongest anti-Francis country in the world, and it's really fed by EWTN. But anyway, that group always tried to get Benedict to attack Francis, because he'd be an easy focus. We actually have a pope, that they could. But Benedict would never do that. Now, Francis is very different from Benedict, not in their theology, okay? Not in their theology, but in the mode of action. And that's, like I remember when John the 23rd was Pope, I used to hear from all kinds of people that, I wish I was Catholic, or I would have been a Catholic if he was Pope this sort of thing. In fact, I heard from a Lutheran pastor 2 days before I came up here. He said, if Francis had been Pope, there never would have been a Reformation. And I think that's true. I think that's really true. So is that what you wanted?
What's EWTN?
EWTN is the religious Catholic radio station. It's out of somewhere in the South. It was started by Mother Angelica. And Mother Angelica was never even around when Francis came in. So, that's not the issue. But it has become the tool. And 2 letters the Pope has written are about that. And he never names them, but it's obvious that he's talking about this group that seems to be undermining the unity in the Catholic Church. But it's mainly in the United States. It's really strange. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Father,
Go ahead.
I'm going to stick to the topic. With the writings of Jesus, where the woman is caught or accused of adultery, any clarity or any church teaching on what Jesus did when he knelt down and he wrote on the sand or on the?
No. The question about when Jesus wrote in the sand, you've probably heard what I've heard from the pulpits, that he was writing names, and that as the name was given, the thing went away. But not really. According to the Jewish tradition, the most important person is the oldest person. So as soon as no witness threw a stone, they would all look at the oldest person. And then he would slink away, and then look at the next oldest. That's the way you do in Judaism. And so that's, I think, what was going on with regards to the people leaving. But as far as writing in the sand, he could just have been making signs, just waiting for it to work through. It's one of the professors I had, a scripture professor, described it as throwing a bowling ball and then standing there waiting for it to hit the thing. So he had said what needed to be said. He just waited till it worked through the crowd.
It was probably practicing patience.
He had probably practicing patience. That's right.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Your comment about everything that happens to me is a gift from God.
Yep.
Is a really interesting statement.
Mm-hmm.
Expand on that a little more?
I just think that everything that happens to us all the way through our lives ultimately is an opportunity that God gives us to act in a certain way and to build in a certain way. And sometimes it's really done by tragedy and stuff like that. But again, I look at my life that all the stuff that went on, the real difficulty, was aimed at what I am now. And I don't know how else he would have done it, you know? I don't know how he would have gotten me into the Pontifical University, the very liberal Pontifical University in Canada, without getting me thrown out of the most conservative seminary in the whole world. You know, I don't know how he would have done it. And so I look at the different things, and I'm the type of personality that very fixes on a goal, and I need to be seriously kicked to change directions. So he had no problem kicking me, you know? Had no problem just redirecting me. But it's, you can't, you know, you just watch it. Go ahead.
Any practical advice that, through the weekend people are hearing certain things and thinking, maybe that's a gift that I have, but I really don't know how to foster it or what to do within the church?
Mm-hmm.
How to sort of maybe exercise some of this stuff when we go back home, or?
I think if you find a particular gift that you feel, that you may have, I think you should look for opportunities to exercise it, and you should simultaneously look for someone who does it well. Because then you combination have a mentor and a lab, okay? So you can find out from them to somehow hone the gift. And secondly, you can exercise the gift and sort of see how that works. And the other thing is that most of the gifts, as we've seen, orient towards other people. And remember the importance of their feedback, okay? That, I would say that the most serious medical problem in the world today is not listening to patients. And doctors will not listen to what a patient says. Like, you come in and they sort of put it in your mind. I had an incident just recently, I have lots of them. It's very difficult to get blood out of me. And one of the reasons is I'm a bleeder. If I start bleeding, I don't stop. And like if I'm shaving and nick myself, I have 4 hours. If it doesn't stop in 4 hours, I go to the emergency room. And sometimes I'll be in the emergency room once a week for 3 months, you know? It's just nicking yourself shaving, you know? So anyway, I went in to give blood. And if you have a bleeding thing like I do, your body doesn't let people into your veins. So it's very difficult to get blood. So I had this woman come into the room, and she had 5 student nurses with her when she came in. And I explained to her it's very difficult to get blood out of me. So almost always, the doctor or the nurse will use a butterfly, which is a way of putting the veins on my hands. As you get older, the veins on your hands are very prominent. So the veins on my hands are very prominent. It's more painful than the arm thing, but actually it's once, whereas the arm thing is not once with me. And she says, oh no, she said, I've done this 1,000 times. Blah, 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 blah. Okay? So she puts the needle in. Of course, it doesn't work. And she moves it around, back and forth, and moves it up. And finally, she took the needle out. And I said, I know you were trying to prove to that group of women that you knew what you were doing, but you have just proven you don't. And I want someone else to come in. She says, no, I'll try the butterfly. I said, no, you won't. Not on me, you won't. And so I had someone else come in. But I think that happens in all kinds of things. Like as a teacher, I think there are a lot of teachers who have never listened to a student. If you're a chef, there are a lot of chefs who've never listened to someone in the thing. If you're a waiter, you know that, I don't know how many of you have ever been a waiter. A waiter is a really good thing to try for a while because you learn all people are different. And some people want you to be hovering over them like they're the only person in the restaurant. Other people want you to get away and have that privacy. But I think as a waiter, you learn to listen to people, okay? In the Charismatic Renewal, one of the things we used to do as a speaker, that wherever I went to a place, I was assigned a young man whose job it was to be my servant. They were assigned them. Now, none of us are used to living with servants, so what do we know? But that young man would come to my room in the morning before the talk and would knock on the door, and he would responsible to take me to the talk and find out if there was anything I needed and this sort of thing. But you learn to listen to someone. That's what it was about. You do that with 2 or 3 people and they never did it again, but you learn to listen. But so I think one of the things in exercising your gift, learn to listen to the person. And I think about one of the things about charity, I had someone who was really good to me about this. I was in the, the homeless shelter, serving meals. And, I thought I was doing a good job of it and everything. But a young lady came up to me and said, you speak nicely to us and everything, but you've never sat down at the table with us, and we notice you have never eaten anything you serve us, that you go home or wherever you go and eat somewhere else. And she said, you would do more for us by eating with us than by serving us. And so, that would never occur to me. But then when I'd go to the homeless thing, I would serve, and when the people were served, I'd serve myself a dish and sit down with someone. So that, but to be able to listen to where you're exercising and allow it to form you.
Can I add to that maybe and ask quickly, I think it's important to give some feedback to people if you're on target. Is there anybody who might have any comments or thoughts of Father Jim about his presentations this weekend or the masses? Anything that kind of jumped out at you that was helpful? I know hearing about the saints at the beginning of the masses was phenomenal. I love hearing that, and it makes the whole thing make so much more sense.
Yeah.
And hungry to study the things who've gone before us. Eric?
I think the Station of the Cross, just that presentation was very powerful. I think.
I would be willing to bet that when we've done this thing, that's the most important moment for most people on it. Yeah, I'm not really sure what. The Stations of the Cross are probably the most important devotion in my life. Like, I'm not big into the rosary. If I'm sick or something and can't think to do the normal prayers a priest does, then I do rosaries to replace the hours. You're allowed to do that as a priest. But the rosary is not a big devotion, but the stations are. It really is. Yeah.
Just the interpretation of the falls too was something very powerful. I think, you mentioned that in Scripture it doesn't talk about the falls, right? But the message of these, the images of him falling is basically us falling, getting up.
Yeah.
From these falls is powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I see that, though, that each year that's, I think, a very powerful thing for people. That's why they repeat it every year. It's the one thing that's repeated every time.
Father, I don't know if I speak for others, but in the 4 years I've been here with you, I have learned more about my faith that I've lived all my life and been a Catholic. I've learned so much information as to what is behind what we've been told, studied, and that information you've given me and us is, I think, one of the most valuable things involving my Catholic faith I've ever had. And I just want to absolutely thank you for it.
I thank you for saying that. Yeah. Yeah. And the main thing that at the bottom of it, I think so many Catholics live their lives under the thought that they might not be saved. And I'd love to be able to go into each Catholic heart and pull that out like a weed. That I think this idea of thinking of God is not generous enough to save me, or Jesus is not powerful enough to have saved me by his death, or the Spirit not empowered enough to, that terrifies me that people think that way. And I think it makes, you spend your life doing what's already been done for you. You're saved. Don't worry about that now, Go ahead.
Another feedback, I would say too, that the ability to take the things that Kevin talked about and understanding the faith and the history, but being able to give us examples, concrete examples of how to apply that in our day-to-day lives when we go back to jobs, families,
Yeah.
is an important aspect too of the teaching.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. Go ahead.
Father, I just want to thank you for your living proof of working through and accepting the gift you have, which is to speak, despite having a learning disability. I think it speaks volumes to me as having a speech impediment and still being able to navigate and manage that, and still rely and humbly rely on a gift that you're given.
Exactly.
I just want to exemplify that and thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I was just going to make a comment with Father Jim, having hung out with him for a few years. He reads the Bible and he translates it into street talk to you understand. How many homilies or priests you talk to, and he's saying these words, and you're trying to relate it to me. What's happening in my life? And one of his gifts is he puts it in street language, so you get it. And I always tell people, you'll say in 5 minutes, and you'll remember, Stations of the Cross. 20 years from now, you're going to remember, you know what? You go to someplace else, God, that was really cool. With the Stations of the Cross and what was said. It brings it from a book to reality. And I think that's one of Father Jim's gifts, is to take that sort of fairy tale, what we read in the Bible, to reality, to apply it to your own personal life, not just on Sunday, but just Monday through Sunday, which is pretty cool.
One last comment, was Jacob trying to? Go ahead.
I just said, who's speaking? Good. Okay, go on.
I keep seeing you trying to get the word out.
So last year it was amazing when you talked about the Eucharist. Things that I was a raised Catholic. I came to the faith much later. And that was the one deciding factor that brought me to the Catholic Church was I truly believed that was the body and blood of Christ. And when you brought the Eucharist, it's so many of us talk about just in a simple language and all this. Jesus has been my Lord and Savior for many years, but at that moment in the Mass last year, he became my best friend. And had that friendship with God, and talk about friendship with God. And then this time came to talk about the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And I haven't been fortunate enough to have the Holy Spirit working in my life for many, many years. And I love to see that that might be a topic like today that many of us don't even know about that well, or what it means to have the gifts of the Spirit, or see it manifest. And so I really thank you for bringing the Eucharist last year, the gifts of the Spirit. And I don't even know if it's possible, but the thing that is in my life is the Father, the relationship with the Father, God the Father. That's one of the hardest things for me to wrap around for whatever reason. But it seems like you went from the Eucharist, Jesus, to the gifts of the Spirit. It'd be like the trifecta of the Holy Spirit. I don't know if we could do this one time, but the next year, some year, what your thoughts are about the Father. Possibly.
Yeah. It's a possibility. Yeah. Go. Pardon?
I want to build on what Jake was talking about.
Okay.
My first time up here was last year,
Mm-hmm.
for the Eucharist. And I'll never receive the Eucharist without thinking about what you said about that we consume the body and blood, but Christ is consuming us. And
Mm-hmm.
so it changed forever the way I receive the Eucharist. And the prayer I say, I go back and I think about, I ask Christ to consume me,
Mm-hmm.
protect me from evil, and protection from my family, and from temptation. But it's just a different experience. The experience I have now when I receive the Eucharist is so
Mhm.
different now. And I want to thank you. It
Oh, thank
changed
you.
my life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Very good, thank you.
Okay.